currently by Hakeem Jeffries. And then
And there's the problem.
the other side, you got Bernie Sanders, AOC, Mamdani, and like a growing network of these candidates and organizers and institutions connected to the Democratic Socialist of America, or the DSA.
Hmm.
And these people are no longer merely disagreeing over policy. They are trying to remove one another from office. And that's generally how you know that the family discussion has become a bit too serious. Like Sanders has spent this entire primary season endorsing challengers running against sitting Democratic members of Congress. Jeffries, whose job it is to protect and ideally expand the Democratic caucus, has backed all of the incumbents. Sanders says the party has failed working people and must be rebuilt from the foundation up.
I think I would tell Bernie to hit the road if I was the party.
That's where we're kind of stuck at, because the momentum outside of what the party can even control has become too much, because Jeffries is sitting there trying to say that the Democrats need utility and discipline and candidates that are capable of actually winning broad majorities, not in deep, deep, deep blue places. So, like in plain English, like Sanders thinks that the House is rotten. Jeffries believes that Bernie Sanders is standing in the living room with a sledgehammer while Republicans are waiting outside with a can of gasoline. It's not a minor disagreement. The fight is over who owns the House and whether there's even going to be a House when they get finished with it all. So, like, if you look in North Carolina, Sanders backed a candidate called Nadia Alam, and it was against a sitting Democratic Congressman, Valerie Fushi. Foshi. I never knew how to say it correctly. But she was a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, and Alam ran, and ran as a younger, more aggressive, progressive alternative, and she lost. And Fushi survived, and that result mattered because it demonstrated something that social media and then the media in turn resists, that a million viewers are not a million voters. A candidate can trend all day and still lose at the ballot box. Like Bernie can endorse you, activists can fill the room, and your campaign video can look like the opening credits of like The Patriot. But sooner or later, somebody has to actually go to a precinct and put your name on a ballot. And politics remains stubbornly old fashioned that way. And then you have something that popped up like New York. Mamdani, Sanders, and the socialist backed challengers against these Democratic incumbents. Jeffries backed the incumbents, and New York, what I assume Jeffries would call the insurgency, won. And Mamdani backed candidates won all three of their big congressional primaries, defeating two Democratic incumbents. And that's worth noting as well, because it showed that like the socialist left can turn that digital attention into actual electoral power, at least in heavily Democratic urban districts. So where it gets confusing is now both sides have evidence. The left can point to New York and say, you see, the future is arriving. The DSA is here. And then the establishment can point to North Carolina and say the future appears to have missed its connection on its flight to reality, because this only works in places that we're going to vote Democratic regardless of the definition you change. And both sides can cite real elections, like very real elections, real results. And both sides can claim that they have momentum. And both sides can locate some political scientist somewhere willing to explain the result confirms exactly what they wanted to already believe. But there is a distinction we have to keep making. Influence is not the same thing as popularity. Views are not votes. Retweets aren't a precinct. A rally packed is not representative of a sample unless the whole, country has suddenly become 27 years old and lives within a walking distance of, an oat milk latte. Like a political position can dominate social media without actually commanding majority support. There's like a movement can win a Democratic primary in a district where a small, intensely motivated group turns out and then announce to America that we have now entered a new ideological age. And they would like to believe that it has, but one congressional primary is a thin, thin place to try to hang that much history. It does not make the victory that they won in those small precincts or districts illegitimate. Doesn't mean they don't count. It means we should be honest about what the election actually measured. It measured which faction organized the most committed voters inside one party, in one district, in one primary. Like, it can be tremendously powerful. It can change Congress, it can change a party, but it does not automatically create some national mandate. Like a primary victory proves that you won a primary. Everything beyond that requires a lot more evidence. And this is where the Democratic Socialists have become strategically effective. They don't need to persuade half of America tomorrow. They don't even need to persuade half of the Democratic Party today. They need to identify districts where the Democrat nominee is almost 100% guaranteed to win a general election, and then they need to defeat the incumbent in the primary. Once they do that, they've effectively captured a congressional seat, not by defeating Republicans in a swing county, but by defeating Democrats in districts where the Republican nominee may serve roughly the same purpose or practical purpose as like the plastic triangle thing on a pizza box. It's pointless. We all know what it's there for, but it's just for show. Like the DSA describes like its endorsements as part of this broader, and I believe they call it, quote, a theory of power. And that's the sort of phrase political organizations use when we have a plan doesn't sound serious enough. But in fairness, they do have a plan. And these aren't, merely symbolic campaigns. Like the objective is to build an organized political structure capable of changing institutions from within. Like I've called an infiltration into the Democratic Party earlier, but infiltration sounds secretive. This is not secretive. Nobody's slipping into the party headquarters disguised as like a copy repairman. Like they're telling everybody what they're doing. Like they're using the Democratic Party's ballot line, their infrastructure, the safest districts to elect candidates whose political identity may be rooted more deeply in socialist movement than in a traditional democratic establishment. They're not creating a third party because third parties in America just get crushed. They either lose, they help somebody else lose, or receive 1.8% of the vote and deliver a deeply principled concession speech. So, like, instead, they're attempting to capture the existing party from inside of it. And the strategy is easier to understand when you stop looking only at the candidates and start looking at the sequence. Like, attention creates momentum, momentum creates legitimacy, legitimacy creates influence. And influence is eventually presented to a voter as inevitability. If you look at why Kamala Harris is currently leading the polls for the next Democratic presidential candidate, it's that sort of influence is just viewed as inevitability. And a socialist candidate wins in some low turnout primary in a deeply, deeply Democratic district. The victory in that district starts to generate national headlines. The headlines generate online attention. The attention is treated as evidence of broad public support. And then you get Democratic leaders who are becoming nervous about, appearing old or timid or out of touch with the future. So they begin borrowing parts of that movement's language, then slowly adopting its priorities. Then, inch by inch, portions of the policy agenda, and then the movement grows. Not necessarily because millions of Americans woke up one morning, read Karl Marx over breakfast, and decided, all right, let's nationalize the power company. That seems like a good thing to do today. It grows because a small, very disciplined, highly organized faction learns to exercise influence far beyond its numerical size. And that's not uniquely socialist. It's how political parties have always moved. Most people are working and raising kids, paying bills, and you know, the activists are at a meeting, and the people at the meeting tend to write the platform. And the real source of the movement's power, not merely popularity, not merely celebrity, it's discipline. A political party is usually large, distracted, and disconnected coalition. A, a faction is much smaller but much more focused. Like a party's trying to win elections and raise money, manage personalities, try to protect their incumbents as best they can, and keep, 20 constituencies from leaving the room. A faction has one job: move the party. That difference matters a ton because the establishment may have more voters, but the insurgents got a lot more time. Like establishment may control the institution, but insurgents may care a lot more about changing it. And in a political organization, the people who care, the most often gain leverage over the people who just genuinely agree in general. And like the establishment, they see a seat. A movement sees a foothold. The establishment just sees one election. An insurgency movement sees a 10-year project. And the establishment asks whether a candidate can win in November. A movement asks whether the campaign can move the party by the next decade. And that's why a primary loss doesn't always represent, from their perspective, a failed effort. Like a challenger can lose and still frighten an incumbent and the establishment. Like a campaign can fail while still building a donor list. Like a candidate can fall short and still force the party to adopt new language, start talking in a new way, or like prioritizing different things from a platform that you thought polled way better than you ever considered. Movements are not just measure success by offices won or elections won. It also measures it by positions shifted, politicians that you intimidated, and ideas moved from what would be considered the absolute edge of conversation towards the center. And the next major test for all of this comes in Michigan, August 4th. Congresswoman Haley Stevens, she represents the more traditional Democratic coalition. And then there is, as I'm sure many of y'all have seen, Abdul El Sayed, who is backed by Sanders, AOC, all the leaders of the progressive left, Hassan Piker, who dressed like Mao Zedong to give a speech. You get the general idea. And the primaries become like a storage unit for nearly every unresolved argument within the Democratic Party. And there's a lot. Israel and Gaza, corporate money, APAC, the generational change, race, gender, electability. And beneath all of it is the central question. Should Democrats move towards the center in order to win competitive states, or should they move sharply to the left to energize younger voters who are more ideological and more increasingly frustrated young voters? And Michigan's not merely another primary, it's a test of whether the socialist populist model can expand beyond the safest Democratic districts and capture a nomination in a state Democrats will actually have to fight to win in November. And so that distinction matters. Winning a Democratic primary in a district where the nominee is likely to receive 75, 80% of the general election vote is one kind of achievement. That was an achievement within the Democratic Party. Winning statewide in Michigan is another. A safe district rewards like ideological intensity. A competitive state requires like an ideological translation. You got to be able to explain your ideas not only to activists who already speak that language, but to voters who don't follow political discourse all day. They don't share every assumption. They may not hear the phrase theory of power and assume, somebody is discussing the electric bill. Like in a safe district, ideological intensity is of a massive advantage. In a competitive state, it's luggage that you're lugging on your back. And the airline charges extra for every position that frightens a suburban voter. That's the establishment's argument, at least. It its concern is not merely that, a socialist candidate might defeat a Democratic incumbent. Its concern is that these candidates are going to become like the public face of their national party. And Republicans are going to take the most radical sentence spoken in Brooklyn or the Bronx, Denver, or some college auditorium anywhere in America and use it against a Democrat running in Michigan or Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin. That's how national politics work now. Candidate says something in a safe district. A consultant will clip 12 seconds of it. A narrator with a voice that sounds like Michael Buffer is like, this is today's Democratic Party. And somewhere in suburban Detroit, a candidate has to explain a position he never took on a subject they never discussed. Republicans don't have to prove that every Democrat is a socialist. They only have to alert enough voters that the Democratic leaders cannot and will not control the socialist wing of their own party. But, Jeffries in the establishment, they got a problem too. They can't dismiss every insurgent victory as a fluke, an anomaly, or just some like uncomfortable clerical error involving their very precious democracy as they see it. There's a real danger inside that Democratic coalition because young voters are frustrated and uninformed. Working class voters are increasingly starting to believe that the party speaks fluent institutionalism, but is only conversational when it comes to talking to a human. Democratic leaders talk about stakeholder engagement. Voters talk about rent. Leaders talk about preserving norms. Voters are pissed off that their cereal costs $6. And then they have their Democratic leaders talking about like robust policy frameworks. Voters would like to know why a routine doctor's appointment now had made them take out a loan. Like, socialist left has been very effective because it offers a simple explanation for that frustration. It does not say the system is malfunctioning. It says the system is functioning exactly as the powerful people who designed it wanted it to function. And that's a pretty powerful political message to the incompetent. It gives voters not only a complaint, but it gives you a villain. Your rent's not just high, your health care is not just expensive, and your wages, oh, they're not just stagnant. Somebody benefits from keeping them away from you. That message can resonate even with voters who don't fully understand or fully support whatever democratic socialists' moving definition of what they are is. Affordability is the bridge. I mean, you start throwing out free healthcare, free childcare, rent controls, government built housing, student debt cancellation, higher taxes on the very wealthy, greater government control over essential industries. Like each proposal can be presented as a relief of a very real and genuine financial pressure. But a slogan is simple. The trade offs are not. But slogans get people elected, trade offs don't, because slogans don't have to stop to explain where the money comes from. They don't automatically make the proposals wrong. It means popularity can't be measured merely by asking voters whether they enjoyed the benefit. Like nearly every government program sounds popular when described as free assistance administered by very competent people. The difficulty starts when the next questions arrive. Who pays? Who's going to be in charge of that? Who's administering that whole thing? What happens when the demand exceeds what we got in supply? What becomes more expensive? Does anything have to be rationed? What happens when the policy encounters Congress or the courts or the states or the bureaucracy or the first government website constructed on some late Friday afternoon? Movements offer moral clarity. Government is supposed to offer a login page informing you that your password expired. That's the distance between some campaign promise and actual public administration. So the Democrat Civil War isn't merely a fight between liberals and socialists. It's a fight between two different theories of political success. Someone like Hakeem Jeffries can believe that the Democrats must build a broad coalition, protect incumbents, and win those competitive districts and assemble enough seats to govern. Sanders believes, to the best of my understanding, that the existing Democratic establishment is one of the reasons that the country is in its present condition, or so he would describe. He thinks replacing Republicans without transforming the Democratic Party would simply just put new people behind the same desk. And Jeffries is trying to control his own house. Sanders is trying to win control and burn that house down and then be able to build it up the way he wants. Jeffries is asking, how do we get 218 seats? Sanders is hollering, what is the point of 218 seats if the party will not fundamentally change this entire system? Sometimes those goals overlap, but very rarely do they. And the establishment believes that, they believe the left may sacrifice winnable elections in the pursuit of ideological purity. Like the left believes the establishment keeps winning offices without delivering changes that apparently they said they promised voters. And so the establishment will ask, what good is a platform if you can't win? Insurgency socialists would ask, what good is winning if nothing important changes? Now, that's a real dispute, not simply left versus center, like coalition versus movement building, or like the idea of like electability versus transformationalism. Winning the institution versus deciding, what institution actually does after you win it. So there, as these primaries continue, don't measure the socialist like movement only by the number of views or airtime that candidate gets. Don't measure it only by the viral clips or the glowing profiles, the rallies with very loud people, or people announcing online that the old order has collapsed. Look at the votes, look at the turnout, look who participated, and look where the victories actually happen. See whether the candidates can win outside ideologically just concentrated urban districts that it wouldn't have mattered what they said if they had that letter next to their name. And you got to look whether like the policies remain popular after voters hear the costs, see the trade-offs, have to deal with the repercussions of the implementation details, not merely be told about the benefits. And most importantly, watch how the rest of the Democratic Party behaves after every victory. Because a faction does not have control. They don't have to control a party formally in order to control it and direct it politically. It only has to make the rest of the party just afraid enough to resist. It doesn't have to win every primary. It has to win enough that incumbents begin changing their votes before a challenger is even announced. It's got to win enough that the party leaders start borrowing their language to avoid becoming the next target of it. It's got to win enough that the movement, like their priorities, become the price of peace within a democratic coalition. And that's exactly how factions gain power. First, the party will laugh at them. Then it argues with them. Then they see that it got some traction and they'll start to borrow some of the language, adopt portions of the agenda. And then finally, everybody goes on television and explains that this was the party's position all along. And that's the real battle we see taking place. Not simply, who wins the next election, but who gets to define what winning is and for who. And who gets to decide what being a Democrat means after all the ballots are counted. Because the definition of what even being a Democrat means anymore seems like a moving target that I couldn't hit. I mean, and you're like, how much has it moved, you think, from your perspective in the past, let's call it 2014?
You talking about
This,
how much has the Democrat Party changed?
how would you could you even define it anymore?
I would say the change goes back even further than that. I think really, if you listen to what Obama said in 2008, hope and change, fundamentally going to change the country, and he did. And I really think from that point on, basically from 2012 on, the party's been hijacked. I think Pelosi and Schumer did a good job of kind of keeping it at bay. But as soon as Pelosi got out and Jeffries took over, he couldn't handle them. He can't handle them like she could. And now you're stuck with the mess that you have now. And I think it goes back to leadership. I think Hakeem Jeffries is it's poor leadership on his part. And that's what as much as I'm not a fan of Nancy Pelosi, you got to give her credit for, she could at least keep the crazies in her
She was
party at
not to be
bay.
trifled with.
Correct.
And
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
I there was many things that I wish that she would have allowed to be trifled with that she stood in the way of, but if she decided this is not happening,
It wasn't
like
happening.
that was a hell or high water, full stop, like Seven Nation Army, it's not happening.
Not going to
So
happen. Yeah.
yeah, and that so I think in talking about this transition, I think it's useful to understand how the socialist left is trying to gain influence over the Democratic Party, but the strategy that I was talking about before is kind of only half the story. The more important question is, what happens if the strategy works? Because it's not. simply a movement asking Democrats to spend a little more on healthcare or build a few more apartments or tax billionaires at a higher rate. Like those are popular talking points, and those parts are always, you know, postered up in the front window or on the bumper sticker. But behind them is a much broader ideological project involving immigration enforcement, pricing, prisons, private property, national defense, energy, education, and the basic structure of American government. And that deserves more attention than it receives because the Democratic Socialists of America is not a conventional liberal reform organization. It's not merely the Democratic Party with stronger labor laws and a younger communication staff. It's a long term goal to replace capitalism with a socialist political and economic order. And I feel like that distinction is really important because a liberal asks how markets can be regulated. A socialist asks why markets should be allowed to control essential parts of life or even exist at all. Like a liberal wants a safety net. A socialist movement is going to seek public or collective control over housing, healthcare, energy, transportation, finance, and all major industries. And that's not a difference in degree. That's a completely different destination. And yet the movement is often discussed as though it were simply, proposing some Scandinavian version of healthcare with maybe some nicer buses. Throw a double decker in there. Nicer buses are not the whole program. Like, consider immigration. Like, parts of the socialist and abolitionist left advocate for eliminating or completely dismantling immigration enforcement. The language may include abolishing ICE or ending detention or stopping deportations or treating freedom of movement as a basic human right. Some activists go further and reject national borders as unjust restrictions on human movement. And the language has this moral appeal to people who don't understand the world. It presents the border as some arbitrary line that separates one human being from another. But government without a meaningful border, like, is not merely being generous. It's surrendering one of the basic responsibilities of a government, deciding who can enter and under what conditions and for how long. Every functioning country does this. Not because every foreigner is dangerous or because migrants lack dignity, but because public systems operate within limits. Housing's limited, schools are limited, hospital capacity, they got a cap on that. Infrastructure, we only got so much. Like employment markets are not infinitely elastic. A nation can choose to admit more people, it may choose to admit fewer. It may create generous asylum rules, guest worker programs, or these paths to citizenship. These are legitimate democratic choices, but no meaningful enforcement is not immigration policy. It's the refusal to even have one. And the moral problem runs both ways on that thing because the chaotic border doesn't merely burden taxpayers, it rewards smugglers, it encourages really dangerous journeys for desperate families. It creates an underground labor force so vulnerable to exploitation, and it allows wealthy households and corporations to benefit from inexpensive labor while poor communities absorb much of the pressure on housing and schools and wages, public services. A policy can be described as compassionate while producing deeply uncompassionate results. Good intentions do not make disorder humane. And as far as these other policies they threw out, we can go to policing. The serious abolitionists left in a few prominent characters within that party have argued that policing is not just flawed as an institution that needs a reform, but it is an inherently oppressive one that should eventually be eliminated and replaced. Like the argument usually begins with real abuses, unjustified shootings or corruptions, racial disparities, aggressive attacks, police unions protecting some bad officer. Like those problems are serious and they demand accountability. But there is a large moral and practical distance between reforming an institution and abolishing its core function. Every society has people who commit violence. Sadly, every society going back in history has domestic abuse and assault, robbery, organized crime, fraud, stalking, political violence, and just ordinary people being a-holes. But like a society can rename the people who respond to those acts. They might give them different uniforms. It may, divide their duties amongst specialized agencies. And, you might throw out a mental health professional in situations where, some armed officer might not be necessary. Those reforms are worth looking into. But somebody still has to have the legal authority to investigate crimes, detain dangerous people, protect victims, and use force when it's necessary. Abolishing the police does not abolish violent behavior. It only brings up the question, who's going to confront it? And if the answer is neighborhood committees or some unarmed responder or informal community defense, or the next obvious question is what happens when the violent person inevitably refuses to cooperate? At that point, some coercive authority needs to return. It has to return with less training, less accountability. Like power doesn't disappear because an institution was abolished. It just moves, and often into far less visible hands. The same problem appears in their platform calls to abolish prisons and jails, which is just wild because like the American criminal justice system has its failures. Some sentences are excessive, some prisons are brutal and not up to standards. You know, detention can punish poor defendants before they've ever even been convicted. The idea of rehabilitation is often neglected far more than it should be. Like there's very powerful arguments within that to reform and discuss. These are not arguments for pretending that every dangerous person can safely remain in the community. Some people commit acts so violent or predatory or so repeated that society just has a duty to restrain them, not as revenge or an I told you so, just as protection for the rest of society. The first moral obligation of criminal justice is not, you know, to comfort the offender. It is to the innocent person who should not become the next victim. And any system of justice has got to ask what it owes the accused, but it's also got to ask what comes, like what it owes the abused spouse, the assaulted child, the shopkeeper who had a gun pointed in their face, like the family of the person murdered by someone with a rap sheet longer than a CVS receipt, like, like a politics that speaks only about the humanity of offenders and rarely about the fear of the victims is not morally complete. Mercy matters, so does protection. Like a decent society has got to be capable of both. And there's strains of the socialist thought that like seek to weaken or like replace so many of these foundational constitutional structures. Like some of these people running for office have stated that the presidency is too powerful, and they oppose the Senate because it gives unequal representation to states. Some have serious questions about abolishing the Supreme Court or the Electoral College, federalism, the Constitution, the separation of powers. Like now, criticism of all of those institutions by itself, completely fine. Talk about them. America has debated them since the beginning of this republic. But there's a difference between reforming a constitutional system and dismantling every institution that prevents one temporary majority from exercising unchecked power. Like the American system is frustrating by design because power is divided. Legislation is thoughtful and slow. Courts interfere. States resist. Elections, produce a divided government. Presidents, discover that giving a speech is easier than passing a law, and it can be maddening. But the inefficiency does have a purpose. It forces political power to pass through competing institutions. It protects minorities from sudden majorities. It stops one faction from controlling the entire government after one successful election. Like people often dislike the checks and balances when their side is losing and love it when they're winning. And they rediscover that value when the other side is on the other end of it. Like abolishing restraints on power for these democratic socialists might feel liberating when your allies hold it. I promise you it's going to feel pretty damn different when your opponents inherit that same machinery you constructed. Like the economic program presents its own just logistical impossibilities. Housing, healthcare, energy, banking. I mean, healthcare as a whole, we've tried bits and pieces of, and we know how this functions with us now. But pushing something that has never worked, ever, driven more people into poverty than any institution in human history, killed hundreds of millions in the past 100 years, and just say those guys didn't get it right. We locked it down now. Trust us. I took a class at Sarah Lawrence. I got this. Is one of the more intellectually dishonest things you can do, but also never mistake the amount of coverage the insanity gets, because it is newsworthy, for a baseline of that's what they all believe. And that's what the Democratic Party is wrestling with right now. And I think that we all, as a society, need to make sure that they wrestle with it healthily, because you need a solid opposition party, not a bunch of nut jobs. And with that, I appreciate y'all being in the middle of it with me. I'm Jeb Hart, and I'll see y'all tomorrow. Careful, be kind, be good.